He sat in a dark movie theater watching the screen with eyes full of big dreams. He was only a 12-year-old kid in a cold, gray city, but his mind was racing with ideas. Most kids in that theater were screaming for the singer on stage, but this boy was making plans. He watched the man in the pink jacket moving his hips and thought something so brave it would change music forever. He looked at the king of British pop music and said to himself, "I could be better than that." That boy was George Harrison. The man on the screen was Cliff Richard. And this is the story of a 50-year secret competition that finally ended in the most amazing way possible. To really understand this competition, we have to look at what England was like in the 1950s. It wasn't the colorful, loud place we know today. It was a time of black and white, where cities were still broken piles of bricks from the war. Teenagers didn't really exist yet. You were a child in short pants, and then suddenly you were an adult in a gray suit with nothing exciting in between. The radio was boring. It played slow, safe songs that your grandma liked to listen to while knitting. It was a quiet, dull world waiting for something exciting to happen. That exciting thing came from a young man named Harry Webb. He decided he didn't want to be Harry anymore. He changed his name, slicked back his hair with grease, and put on a bright pink jacket that looked like it came from outer space. He became Cliff Richard. When he released his song Move It in 1958, it was like setting off fireworks in a quiet library. Suddenly, British kids had their own hero. It was the first time a British singer sounded like the real rock and roll stars from America. He was dangerous. He was exciting. And he instantly became the English Elvis. John Lennon himself later said that before Cliff Richard and Move It, there was nothing worth listening to in England. Cliff was the king. He was on television, he was in the movies, and he was selling millions of records. Backing him up was a band called The Shadows. They were the coolest guys in London with matching suits and synchronized steps, playing Fender Stratocaster guitars that cost more money than most people made in a year. In the city of Liverpool, a young George Harrison was watching it all. He was fascinated, but he was also thinking critically. He didn't just want to be a fan in the crowd. He wanted to be the guy on stage. Decades later, George admitted the truth about that night in the movie theater. He wasn't dreaming of being Cliff. He was dreaming of beating him. He remembered thinking about big motorboats and tropical islands to escape the dark cold of Liverpool. He saw Cliff Richard not as a perfect idol, but as a target. This shows the fire inside George Harrison even as a child. He looked at the biggest star in the country and didn't see perfection. He saw something he could do better. To understand why George wanted to beat Cliff, you have to understand the power of the Shadows. Cliff was the singer, the face on the posters, but the Shadows were the sound. They were led by a man named Hank Marvin, who wore big, thick glasses and played a red guitar that looked like a spaceship. Every boy in England wanted to be Hank Marvin. The battle between Cliff and George wasn't fought on a battlefield or a football field. It was fought in the hallways of a big white building in London called Abbey Road Studios. This was the factory where hit songs were made. And for a long time, Cliff Richard felt like he owned it. He had been recording there since 1958. Studio 2 was the best room. It was big with high ceilings and had the perfect sound for rock and roll. Cliff Richard was always in Studio 2. It was his second home. But in 1962, everything changed. A new band from Liverpool arrived. They were loud. They had funny haircuts that covered their foreheads. And they were ready to take over. They were the Beatles. At first, Cliff didn't take the Beatles seriously. Why would he? He was the king, and they were nobodies from the north. Cliff admitted later that he laughed when people asked him about the Beatles. He made a joke that he probably regretted for years. He said, "I don't think they're going to make it," and claimed their name sounded like something you step on like a bug. He dismissed them as insects. He thought they were a passing trend, but the joke was on him. The Beatles started taking over Abbey Road. They started booking Studio 2 for weeks at a time. Cliff found himself pushed out of his favorite room. There was a polite but tense battle in the hallways. The Beatles were stealing his studio time, his engineers, and his crown. George Harrison walked those hallways with a smirk. He was the kid who said he could do better. And now he was walking into Cliff's territory and taking over. Cliff Richard was terrified as he watched the Beatles rise. He wasn't just jealous, he was scared for his career. He admitted in his autobiography that he felt a cold fear when he heard them on the radio. He realized he was no longer the only big star in the sky. The sun was setting on his empire, and a new day was starting for the Beatles. He had to fight for his career. He couldn't just coast on his old hits anymore. Despite the competition, they weren't enemies who never spoke. They lived in the same world, shared friends, and even shared staff. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, George Harrison escaped the craziness by recording his masterpiece solo album, All Things Must Pass. But hidden on the third record was a short, strange track called It's Johnny's Birthday. George recorded it as a 30th birthday gift for John Lennon. But the melody wasn't new. George didn't write it. He took the melody directly from Cliff Richard's song Congratulations. As the 1970s rolled in, both men went looking for something bigger than music. They had both achieved fame and fortune, but they felt empty inside. They both found God, but they found him in very different ways. Cliff Richard found Jesus. George Harrison went east. He found his spirituality in India. Yet in spirit, Cliff and George were brothers. They were the only two major rock stars of their generation who were brave enough to put their faith above their fame. In his final years, George Harrison retreated from the world. He bought a giant Gothic mansion called Friar Park. His true passion was the garden. He spent all his days planting trees, digging in the dirt, and designing landscapes. He loved his garden more than he loved his guitar. Cliff Richard also found peace in nature. He bought a vineyard in Portugal. He spent his time watching grapes grow and making wine. They both found that fame was empty and that true peace came from the earth. When George died in 2001, Cliff was deeply saddened. He didn't speak about their competition or the charts. He simply said George was a beautiful guy full of love for humanity. Now at 85 years old, Cliff Richard has released a book called A Head Full of Music. But the most shocking revelation concerns George Harrison. Cliff reveals a secret conversation that changes everything. George Harrison once said 4 words to him that Cliff has never forgotten. George said, "No shadows, no Beatles.